In this video, I will explain how to select the carbon arrows as well as the arrow components for your hunting arrows. There are many things you need to know about arrows before you go and purchase them to ensure that you get the right ones. Your arrows need to be chosen to match the specific use that they are intended for, as there is a difference between hunting, target, and 3D archery arrows. Each chosen component of the arrow has its specific advantages, disadvantages, and effects on the arrow's flight. By the end of this video, you'll be able to select the right arrows and components to match your desired arrow function and flight characteristics. For this video, we're going to be using the Gold Tip website. It has a feature called Build Your Own Arrow. This feature is going to allow us to choose the arrow components, and we will be able to discuss how all of the different arrow components affect the arrow's flight characteristics. All right, let's begin this process. First, let's click on the Build Your Own Arrow button. The first thing we're going to have to do is choose our application. This video is about hunting arrows, so we'll choose hunting. Now we have a bunch of categories of arrows that Gold Tip offers in their hunting arrow shafts. For the purpose of this demonstration, we're going to be choosing Velocity Hunters. Velocity Hunters are inexpensive arrows that are very light and relatively durable. Determining your draw weight. Some bows have adjustable poundage ranges. If you don't know what your draw weight is, you can look on your bow, in the bow manual, or online. The most accurate way to measure your draw weight is to use a bow scale, which accurately determines the weight that your bow is set to. If you don't have a bow scale, your local bow shop should be able to measure it for you. Determine cut length. When cutting your arrow, you want to have your arrow sticking out past your rest by at least 1 inch. Sometimes arrows are cut a bit longer for young archers so that they will still fit the bow as the archer grows and decides to increase the bow's draw length. For beginner archers, some people also keep their arrows long just in case the arrow tip breaks while missing the target. Occasionally, you can cut it down and reuse it again. Once you have made all of these considerations, choose an appropriate cut length to use as a reference while selecting the correct arrow spine in the manufacturer's arrow selection chart. Once you have determined your draw weight and you have determined your cut length, it's time to take a look on the manufacturer's arrow selection chart to determine what spine of arrow is appropriate for your application. Using an arrow selection chart. The best way to determine what spine of arrow you need for a particular brand is to look at the arrow selection chart for that brand. This can be found on their website, or if you're in a store, you can look at the back of the box for the arrows and usually find some form of chart. This arrow selection chart is for Gold Tip brand arrows. To use the chart, you first select your arrow cut length in the appropriate column at the top of the chart. Next, you select your bow's poundage in the appropriate row on the left-hand side. For the purpose of this demonstration, we are going to choose a draw length of 26 inches. And we are going to use a draw weight of 50 pounds. Now what you need to do is look for the intersection of the chosen column and row. The box where they intersect on the chart will tell you the appropriate arrow spine for your application. In our situation, it tells us that the appropriate arrow spine is a number 2 on the chart. When we look at the legend on the right-hand side, we see that a number 2 corresponds to an arrow that is a 500 spine for Gold Tip. You now know enough information to choose what type of arrow shaft that will work for your application. The next step is to choose the appropriate components to complete the arrow. Now that we've determined that we need a 500 spine arrow, we can go ahead and choose our Velocity Hunter 500. The next thing we need to do is enter the cut length that we used when we were choosing the right spine in the arrow chart. We chose a cut length of 26 inches. To complete your arrows, you will need to choose your components, including the vanes, nocks, inserts, and points. Here we will provide a general look at the components required and some considerations that you need to make. Choosing your field point. Weight is the primary consideration that you need to make when choosing your field point. The arrow needs to be balanced properly from front to back in order to achieve proper arrow flight. This is called front of center balance, or FOC, and it will be discussed later in this video. For now, all that you need to understand is that the heavier your components are on the rear of the arrow, the heavier your components on the front of the arrow will have to be, and vice versa. This website gives us 3 different threaded screw points to choose from. You have an 85 grain, a 100 grain, and a 125 grain point. There are 3 important considerations when choosing a field point weight. Firstly, you want your field points to match the weight of your hunting broadhead, so that you will not need to make major sighting adjustments when you change from your field points to your hunting broadheads. Secondly, you need to consider your front of center balance. This is a precise measurement that usually requires you to do some measuring and math. However, the Gold Tips site will make these calculations for you based on your chosen arrows and components. This is handy because you can test your components before you buy them to make sure that you are creating a balanced arrow. There are benefits of creating an arrow that is front heavy. Firstly, a front heavy arrow will recover from fishtailing and porpoising more quickly and is less susceptible to wind drift, making it more accurate. Secondly, a front heavy arrow is likely to get better penetration through an animal. The disadvantage to a front heavy arrow is that it has a steeper trajectory, as it will tend to nosedive more than an arrow that is balanced a bit further back. There are also benefits to an arrow that is balanced further back. When an arrow is balanced further back, it will have a tendency to fly flatter and farther with a better trajectory. The disadvantage is that it will not recover from fishtailing and porpoising as quickly and is more likely to be affected by wind drift. All of this affects the overall accuracy. Also, an arrow that is balanced further back may not penetrate as well as the front heavy arrow does. In order to know whether your arrow is front heavy or rear heavy, you need to calculate the arrow's front of center balance, or FOC. But first we have to choose your arrow's nock. The main thing to consider here is your nock weight. We will be choosing the lightest nock. Please remember that some nocks are not designed for shooting freehand and do require the use of a mechanical release. These Aculite nocks do require a mechanical shooting release, as they might be dangerous to use when shooting by hand. We're going to choose a green nock. Now that you have chosen all of your components, you need to check how well balanced the arrow is. Gold Tip has a great built-in calculator that tells you your FOC balance based on your arrow and all chosen components, and reports the number before you even buy the items. This is handy because you can experiment with different components to achieve a proper FOC balance without buying the wrong parts. If you take a look at the diagram in the bottom left corner, you will see that the arrow we have constructed with the chosen components has an FOC balance of 14.67%. It is important to remember that there is no perfect amount of FOC balance. It is a compromise between the advantages and disadvantages we have mentioned earlier in this video. There is, however, a generally agreed upon range that you should consider. It is recommended that your calculated FOC balance is between 8% and 12%, with 8% being the furthest back and 12% being the furthest forward that your arrow's FOC balance should be at. If you look at the arrow in the diagram, it is showing that this arrow is front heavy beyond what is recommended. If you are not happy with your arrow's FOC balance, you can either change the weight on the front of the arrow by changing your field point or inserts, or you can change the weight on the back of the arrow by changing your nock and fletchings. In some cases, you can add weights to the front or the back to manipulate the FOC balance. You can see on this Gold Tip website that you do have the option to add some weights. Just remember that too much added weight on the front of an arrow will make it flex more when it's fired. This means that it will act more like a flexible arrow, which may introduce an oscillation or a wobble in its flight. Personally, I'm not happy with this FOC balance of 14.67%. I feel that it's a front-heavy arrow. There is advantages and disadvantages to a front-heavy arrow. I personally have shot a variety of types of arrows with different balances. So what I have found in my shooting is that I prefer to have something that is balanced somewhere between 12 and 8%. In order to change this, I either need to decrease the weight at the front or increase the weight at the back. If I increase the weight at the back, this arrow will become heavier, which means it will fly slower and also means that it will have a poor trajectory in comparison to a lighter arrow. If I lighten the tip, then what will happen is I'll improve my front of center balance as well as improving the speed and trajectory of my arrow. So in this respect, I'm going to choose a lighter tip. All I'm going to do is go back on the Gold Tip site, and instead of using a 100 grain tip, I'm going to use an 85 grain tip. I'm still going to use the same Aculite insert and the same nock, and I will allow the site to recalculate my FOC. If you take a look at the bottom here now, my FOC is at about 12.98%. This is within the range that I prefer. I do prefer a slightly front heavy arrow, but I do like it to be at the furthest most of the gray range here. That way I find I get a nice balance between an accurate and hard penetrating arrow as well as a flat shooting arrow. At this time, we have successfully chosen all of our arrow components. We have explained how to select the carbon arrows as well as the arrow components for your hunting arrows. Remember that each component of the arrow has its specific advantages, disadvantages, and effects on the arrow's flight. Hopefully, you can now select the right arrows and components to match your desired arrow function and flight characteristics. All that's left to do now is to purchase, assemble, and test fire your arrows.